These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get subscribers. Chernobyl cleanup workers in protective suits walk through the empty streets of Pripyat after the nuclear accident in 1986. They were part of the hundreds of thousands of liquidators brought from across the Soviet Union, some allowed to work only a few minutes in the most exposed zones before being replaced. In 1903, the circus elephant Topsy was led onto an electric platform at Coney Island, while Thomas Edison's team filmed every moment. The spectacle was used in the War of Currents to make alternating current look unsafe to the public. German prisoners of war stand packed together in Moscow before the Parade of the Defeated in July 1944. Around 57,000 captured soldiers were marched through the city that day, and workers washed the streets with hoses after they passed. In 1919, a huge storage tank burst in Boston and sent a 15-meter high flow of molasses rushing through the streets at about 56 kilometers per hour. The area stayed sticky for months, and on hot days, people say you can still smell molasses there even now. Turkey's third president, Celal Bayar, sits in the rear seat of a common K-225 helicopter during an air show over Ankara in the 1950s. The former independence fighter used this flight in the country's first helicopter to show how fast the young republic was embracing modern technology. In 1949, a United States Navy ship fired a live torpedo at a giant iceberg during tests in the North Atlantic Ocean. They wanted to see if this weapon could break or move dangerous icebergs away from busy ship routes and keep future convoys safe. In 1912, a woman uses a hand-cranked charging machine to refill the battery of her early electric car. At that time, electric cars were common in many cities and were advertised as clean, quiet, and easier to drive than gasoline cars. In 1970, officials in Oregon tried to remove an 8-ton beached whale near Florence by setting off a large explosive charge along its side. Pieces of the whale flew hundreds of meters through the air, smashing parked cars and shocking the crowd that had come to watch. John F. Kennedy stands almost 300 meters underground in a coal mine, talking directly with miners during his 1960 presidential campaign. He used rare visits like this to show that he would listen to working people long before television studios turned him into a national figure. In 1901, 63-year-old schoolteacher Annie Taylor climbed into a wooden barrel and became the first person to go over Niagara Falls and survive the 51-meter drop. She hoped the stunt would make her rich, but her manager vanished with the famous barrel. Inside a military plane over Bikini Atoll in 1946, a cameraman braces with a heavy movie camera to record one of the first atomic test blasts. Special film teams were sent this close so scientists could study the bright flash and shock waves frame by frame later. In the 1730s, Russian Empress Anna Ivanovna ordered a full-size palace built from ice in St. Petersburg with frozen furniture, dishes, and even decorative cannons. As part of a harsh court joke, she had 2 jesters married there and made them spend their wedding night on an ice bed at minus 30 degrees. In February 1954, Marilyn Monroe visits American troops in Korea and stands by a cake as a soldier gently pins his unit star on her dress. The star on the cake and on his sleeve showed how thankful the soldiers were for her live shows so far from home. In 1917, a French cargo ship loaded with wartime munitions collided with a Norwegian vessel in Halifax Harbor, causing one of the largest man-made blasts before the atomic age. The shock wave and huge harbor wave smashed buildings, hurled people far from the docks. On the set of King Kong vs. Godzilla in 1962, the small stop-motion Godzilla puppet was later given to a child as a gift. That handmade movie prop became one of the earliest Godzilla toys, long before mass-produced action figures filled store shelves. In 1912, inventor Franz Reichelt tested his homemade parachute suit by stepping off the Eiffel Tower in front of a crowd of reporters. The parachute failed to open. He hit the ground with such force that it left a 30-centimeter dent in the frozen soil. This original 1992 wanted poster from Colombia offers 2,700,000,000 pesos for information leading to Pablo Escobar, described here by his full name, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. In the 1850s, fast clipper ships raced from the Caribbean to Australia with their holds packed full of rum for the gold rush camps. The first ship into harbor could sell its cargo for almost the price of gold, so captains drove their crews through fierce storms. 2 Polish prisoners of war stand outside a camp building in 1941 after being released from a Soviet labor camp. When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, thousands of surviving Polish captives were suddenly freed to form the Anders Army and escape through Persia. In 1915, German forces released a thick chemical cloud on the Russian garrison at Osawik Fortress, leaving only a few dozen badly injured defenders still standing. Wrapped in bandages and coughing, they fixed bayonets and charged so hard that about 7,000 attackers panicked. World heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali sits quietly with a brush, working on one of his own paintings in the 1970s. Away from the ring, he loved making art, often drawing boxing scenes and writing short poems in his bold handwriting. Inside the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, 8 sailors' hand cranked the propeller for hours to creep toward a Union warship in 1864. Their attack sank the ship, but the small submarine also went down and lay hidden on the seabed until search teams found. Princess Diana tries an MP5K at a secure indoor range with her police protection officers in 1985. She reportedly liked the training so much that she often came back to practice again with the royalty protection team. After a fuel truck tipped over in Nigeria in 1998, crowds rushed in with buckets and cans to scoop up the spilled gasoline. When the vapors suddenly caught fire, a huge blast and firestorm claimed hundreds of lives in minutes. Adolf Hitler stands at a window of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, while a dense crowd salutes him on the night he becomes Chancellor in January 1933. This quiet window scene marks the moment his rule over Germany begins as thousands gather below to greet their new leader. A pack of trained messenger dogs runs down a stock exchange corridor, each carrying rolled papers in a leather tube. Before fast phone lines and email, brokers even tested dogs as living couriers to move urgent trading orders across the financial district in minutes. In 1945, American soldier Herman Perry stands between Major Earl O. Cullum and Captain Joseph Armand after being captured at the Chabwa Stockade in India. He had vanished into the Indo-Burmese jungle and lived for months among Naga villagers, even joining their community. Swiss Army bicycle troops ride in a long line along an alpine road, using folding bikes to move faster than marching infantry. By the 1940s, Switzerland had about 4,000 such cyclists, and the last units were only disbanded in 2003. An American soldier in Italy runs for cover as a mortar shell explodes on a narrow village street on 24 April 1944. In the early 1900s, American harbor workers used spring-powered mail catapults to launch heavy canvas bags of letters onto passing ships without making them stop. Some bags flew at almost 120 kilometers per hour. In 1935, a huge crowd in Kentucky gathers to watch the public execution of William DeBow, sentenced for a violent attack and robbery of a woman. He spent his final 45 minutes on the scaffold denying every charge and fiercely accusing his victim of lying. In 1925, a sled dog team hauled life-saving serum across 1,085 kilometers of frozen Alaska in about 5 days, with temperatures near -50 degrees. The lead dog, Balto, finished the run with paws so damaged by ice that he could not stand or walk for a week afterward. Jewish residents in Vienna are forced by Nazi supporters to scrub away street slogans that protested the 1938 annexation of Austria. Public scenes like this were staged as early acts of humiliation, showing everyone what happened to those who stood against the new regime. In 1952, the Great Smog of London grew so thick that people on the street could not see their own feet, and cars crawled forward almost blind. The choking coal smoke triggered a huge health crisis and pushed Britain to pass strict clean air laws a few years later. The aircraft carrier USS Franklin leans and burns in the Pacific on 19th of March 1945 after a Japanese bomb set off armed planes on her hangar deck. More than 700 sailors were lost, and only fast help from the cruiser Santa Fe stopped the ship from sinking that day. In 1964, West Berlin students spent 6 months digging a 145-meter tunnel under the Berlin Wall, working only at night in mud and cramped space. In a single night, 57 East Berliners crawled through this passage to freedom before guards discovered the tunnel. In October 1941, 16-year-old Masha Bruskina stands in Minsk with a sign in German and Russian that says, "We are the partisans who shot at German troops." Moments after this photo, she, factory worker Kirill Trus on the left, and 15-year-old Volodya Sherbatovich on the right were publicly executed. In the early 1900s, some American parents briefly used the mail service to send small children to relatives, paying by weight and pinning stamps and tags directly to their clothes. One 6-year-old girl rode about 1,200 kilometers by train for just 15 cents. In April 1943, people in Satakunta, Finland gather around 6 white coffins holding one family after an escaped prisoner attacked their home. The attacker, Toivo Koljonen, was soon captured and given the country's last civilian death sentence of the war. In the winter of 1911, Niagara Falls was choked with ice so thick that people calmly walked across the frozen river just above the brink. For a short time, the place where about 2,800 tons of water usually plunge each second turned into a silent white bridge for curious visitors. New York police line up organized crime enforcers Harry Strauss, Harry Mayone, and Frank Abundando for mugshots on 29 March 1940. The trio belonged to the secret group known as Murder Incorporated, suspected of planning more than 400 underworld attacks across the United States. In 1907, drivers in the Peking to Paris race pushed heavy cars through mud after crossing deserts and swamps on a 16,000-kilometer route. The winner reached Paris in 60 days, while many rivals were left stuck for weeks, repairing broken cars. In 1885, the Russian Empire passed its first major labor law, banning night shifts for women and teenagers under 17 in textile factories. This photo of young apprentices in a workshop shows the world that was slowly changing as Russia began to limit child labor at least after dark. In 1917, during the Russian Civil War, Bolshevik units used tanks to smash the Tsar's wine cellars in the Winter Palace, sending rivers of wine into the streets. About 5,000 tons of wine poured out, and eyewitnesses claimed the city drank from the cobblestones for 3 days. In 1941, British women engineers in Gloucester assemble a Hawker Typhoon aircraft by hand on the factory floor. Many of them were among the first women allowed into heavy aircraft engineering alongside men, quietly changing the rules of the industry. Pony Express riders in the American West changed horses about every 16 kilometers and could cover 120 kilometers in a single shift. Their relay system moved mail from Missouri to California in around 10 days, faster than any other service of 1860. In 1940, families in Sacramento turned worn-out cars into tiny homes, gathering in crowded camps like this on the edge of the city. Many had lost their farms and jobs during the Great Depression and now lived beside the highway in rusted Model A cars and makeshift tents. In 1835, militias from Ohio and Michigan lined up with flags and rifles over a thin strip of land that included the town of Toledo. The so-called Toledo War ended with only one minor injury, when a man was poked with a bayonet during a drunken argument instead of a real battle. Shavarsh Karapetyan, a Soviet fin swimmer and many-time world record holder, saved about 20 people from a sinking trolleybus in Yerevan Lake in 1976. In 1985, he was badly injured while pulling people out of a building on fire. In 1944, Japan built tiny manned torpedoes called Kaiten, where a single pilot lay in a 1-meter-wide metal tube and was sealed inside before launch from a submarine. Most of these high-speed human torpedoes never hit a ship. The oldest still operating Chinese restaurant in the United States is not in New York or San Francisco, but in the copper mining town of Butte, Montana. Pekin Noodle Parlor has served noodles in the same narrow upstairs rooms since 1911, run by the same family through boom times, decline. In 1898, an oil field near Baku caught fire and burned for almost 3 months, with flames 60 meters high that could be seen 100 kilometers away. The sky over the Caucasus stayed dark with smoke, while oil worth millions of gold rubles was lost in the blaze. During the Second World War, Polish doctor Eugene Lazowski used harmless bacteria to fake positive typhus tests and make his town look dangerously sick on paper. The occupying forces quarantined the whole area, and that trick is believed to have saved around 8,000 Jewish people from being taken away. In 1592, the king of Siam and a Burmese prince fought a personal duel on armored war elephants, crashing their animals together for almost an hour in front of both armies. The Thai king finally won by striking his rival with a spear while standing in the high saddle on his elephant. In 1972, television cameras filmed the planned demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex in St. Louis as 33 identical towers fell in clouds of dust. Built in the 1950s as a model of fast and cheap modern housing, it later became a symbol of how badly the dream of factory-style homes for the poor had failed. In 1879, the crew of the ship Jeannette were trapped when the Arctic ice crushed their vessel, forcing them to live on drifting floes for almost 21 months. They marched about 800 kilometers over moving ice, surviving on sled dogs and rats. In 1969, a helicopter crew member sits in the open doorway behind an M60D on the M23 armament mount, turning the cabin door into a tiny post in the sky. Door gunners had to control the weapon, the ammo belt, and radio calls at once while flying so low that treetops could pass by their boots. In 1916, a single avalanche in the Alps buried around 10,000 Italian and Austro-Hungarian soldiers under up to 20 meters of snow in just a few minutes. Both sides even shelled the slopes on purpose to unleash more snow on enemy positions. British Churchill tanks of the 6th Guards Tank Brigade roll forward with the 2nd Glasgow Highlanders near Moergestel in the Netherlands, October 1944. These slow but tough machines were used as moving shields for infantry as they pushed through villages after the failure of Operation Market Garden. In the 1890s, New York fire crews sometimes turned real emergencies into wild races, pushing their 5-ton steam engines and horse teams to reach the hydrant first. At full speed, they could hit about 60 kilometers per hour. In the winter of 1940 in rural Nebraska, a mail carrier turned a Ford Model A body on a Model AA truck frame into an early monster by fitting it with giant airplane tires so he could drive over deep snow. The homemade giant rode so high above the road that strong wind sometimes pushed it sideways off the track. In the 1860s, the United States Army imported about 75 camels from Egypt to patrol the hot deserts of Texas. The Camel Corps' experiment failed when the animals spat at officers, bit soldiers, scared every horse in sight. In 1898, Nikola Tesla showed a small boat in a pool and told the crowd they could steer it by shouting commands. In reality, he was using one of the first radio control systems, secretly guiding the boat with a hidden transmitter. In 1666, a bakery fire in London grew into the Great Fire, destroying about 13,000 houses in 3 days and forcing people to jump into the Thames to escape the heat. The flames were so intense that church bells of copper melted and ran down the streets like glowing streams of metal. Along the Seine in Paris, booksellers called bouquinistes have sold second-hand books and prints from these green boxes for hundreds of years. The scene in 1900 and today looks almost the same, with only the clothes and the skyline changing around them. In 1896, a railroad in Texas staged a head-on crash between 2 steam trains at about 100 kilometers per hour as a show for 40,000 people. The boiler blast sent metal flying almost half a kilometer. In 1908, British suffragettes marched with bold banners in London, demanding a voice in elections that still ignored most women. It would take another 10 years before the law finally granted voting rights to some women over 30. In the 1980s, trainers at Sevastopol in the Black Sea taught dolphins to carry sonar beacons and special gear to spot enemy divers and mines for the Soviet Navy. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the secret unit was reportedly sold abroad. In 1942 in New Hampshire, after a dean said women were too delicate for ROTC, student Dorothy Chen formed her own drill unit and trained 47 classmates at 5 in the morning on frozen fields with no uniforms or support. In the early 1900s, museum artists in New York sculpt a life-size triceratops head that is bigger than a car, carefully carving every wrinkle by hand. At a time when scientists had only a few fossil bones, models like this helped the public see dinosaurs as real animals for the very first time. In the 1880s, ostrich feathers were so valuable that farmers ran huge feather farms like this, selling a single plume for about a worker's monthly wage. When fashion changed and the market crashed, many birds were simply released. In May 1951, a Marine from the 1st Marine Division of the United States uses a flamethrower to sweep a hillside position in Korea, the fire lighting up the valley like daytime. The jet of burning fuel could reach more than 40 meters, clearing bunkers and forest shelters in seconds. In the early 1900s, a strange storm lifted a pond and dropped thousands of frogs onto this town, turning the cobblestone street into a moving carpet of jumping bodies. People spent days scooping them into carts and baskets, one of many recorded animal rains. On the 17th August 1944, an ammunition dump in Cherbourg Harbor erupted and sent a tower of smoke and debris high over the liberated French port. The blast was so strong that ships photographed it from a distance, like a man-made thundercloud rising from the sea. Off the coast of the Bahamas, divers could swim down 10 meters to drop waterproof letters into a working mailbox on the sea floor. Each envelope came back to the surface with a rare sea floor post office stamp, turning a simple postcard into a souvenir from the bottom of the ocean. In November 1943, Coast Guardsmen in a supply boat passed the bow of an LCM landing craft sinking near Tarawa after a direct hit. The lone metal shape sticking out of the water shows how dangerous each short trip across that lagoon was during the Pacific Island fighting. In the winter of 1963, the cold was so extreme that parts of the English Channel froze for the first time in about 200 years, trapping fishing boats in the ice for weeks. The ice grew so thick that daring locals tried to walk across patches of the channel between England and France. On the 5th August 1948, soldiers of the 1st Battalion, Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, filed down the gangway in Singapore at the very start of the Malayan emergency. Many of these men would spend the next years trekking through dense jungle on long patrols instead of fighting on open battlefields. In the 1890s, a slave caravan near Zanzibar forces captured Africans to march hundreds of kilometers toward the coast in chains under armed guards. Many did not survive the long route from the Congo region, which became a silent trail of loss across the center of the continent. On the 7th September 1945, Allied tanks roll in formation down a Berlin avenue for the official victory parade, with the victory column visible in the distance. For one of the last times, soldiers from several former wartime partners shared a single triumph march through the defeated capital. In the winter of 1939-1940, Finnish families like this one left their homes on sleds as fighting reached their villages during the Winter War. Around 400,000 people, nearly 1 in 10 Finns, had to start over in new parts of the country with only what they could carry. In 1933, a traveling dental station near Moscow brought modern tooth care straight into remote villages that had never seen a dentist before. These early mobile clinics were part of a huge campaign to give free medical help to peasants across the Soviet countryside. In 1945, U.S. Marines climb over the burned-out shell of a Mitsubishi G4M bomber on a captured airfield at Iwo Jima, its thin frame riddled with holes. The wreck shows how lightly built these long-range planes were, trading armor for fuel tanks so they could fly deep over the Pacific. In March 1949, visitors near Canton in China examine a Japanese warplane left without wings, parked on a hill above the city like a strange metal monument. Only a few years earlier, it was part of an occupying air force, and now children casually climb on it while a new era begins below. In July 1944, the first echelon of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force lines up to board the USS General W.A. Mann, sailing from the tropics to the battlefields of Europe. Brazil was the only South American nation to send a full Army Corps overseas in the Second World War. On the 6th April 1945, U.S. Army infantry moved quietly through thick woods near Siegen, Germany, on their way to attack barracks still held by enemy forces. Even though Germany would surrender just a month later, patrols like this still had to clear every patch of forest step by step. On the 4th of March 1943, Finnish combat engineers in white winter suits test a captured Soviet ROKS-2 flamethrower in the snowy forests of Karelia. The flame jet was designed to sweep trenches and bunkers clear, turning deep snowbanks into clouds of steam in seconds. In 1961, Finnish soldiers train in full NBC protection suits and gas masks, ready for a world that feared clouds of invisible fallout more than bullets. Cold War armies drilled scenes like this deep in the forest, practicing how to move and fight while sealed inside rubber and plastic. In 1911 and 1912, builders in Amsterdam raised the Hirsch & Company fashion house on Leidseplein, its steel frame growing out of this maze of wooden scaffolds. For many years, it was the city's most stylish department store, and the same building still dominates the square as a local landmark. In 1985, Soviet soldiers stationed in East Germany spend their day off riding a small plane carousel at an amusement park in East Berlin. Even during the Cold War, they took souvenir photos here, like ordinary tourists far from home. On the 5th of September 1914, French and British soldiers rushed forward at the First Battle of the Marne and stopped the German advance just 40 kilometers from Paris. This week-long clash forced armies into long trench lines and turned World War I into a slow, grinding stalemate. On 27 April 1918, two smiling U.S. Army cooks leaned from the windows of Hospital Train No. 54 in Horoville, France. From this rolling kitchen, they served hot meals to hundreds of wounded soldiers every day as the train carried them away from the front lines. In 1901, a British film crew filmed these workers, and one of them throws a reversed V sign at the camera, making this the earliest known moving image record of that cheeky hand gesture. Long before the V for Victory salute of World War II, this two-finger sign was already a symbol of street defiance in Britain. In 1936, future Mad Magazine legends Al Jaffe and Will Elder share food and jokes in their New York high school cafeteria. Years later, these classmates would help shape American satire with Mad's wild parodies and Jaffe's famous fold-in pages. An American paratrooper in Normandy pauses for a street drink with a local Frenchman in the summer of 1944, only weeks after the town of Perrier was freed. Villagers across France often greeted Allied troops with homemade wine and whatever they could spare. French socialite Mademoiselle de Courcelles poses as a Norse Valkyrie at the lavish Devonshire House costume ball in London, 2nd July 1897. The ball celebrated Queen Victoria's 60th year on the throne, with guests dressed as characters from history, legend, and opera. Crowds flood the streets of Buenos Aires in 1955 as leaders of the liberating revolution pushed toward the government house to topple Juan Perón's rule. Within 3 days, the government collapsed, and this march became the turning point that reshaped Argentine politics. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower bites into a ballpark hot dog, while Vice President Richard Nixon smokes beside him during a baseball game in 1960. Even at the height of Cold War politics, the two leaders still did classic American stadium rituals side by side. Honduran National Guard soldiers guard a quiet street in downtown Tegucigalpa during a period of political tension in 1963. The force would remain a key pillar of military rule for decades before being dissolved in the late 1990s as Honduras moved to reform its security forces. Teenage Arnold Schwarzenegger trains as an Olympic-style weightlifter in a small gym in Graz, Austria, 1964. Within 6 years, this unknown kid would become the youngest ever Mr. Olympia and start reshaping bodybuilding history. During Operation Nordwind in the winter of 1944, a French soldier carries a baby through the snow as families escape the German advance in Alsace. This moment of protection unfolded during the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Pizzaiolo Raffaele Esposito poses while preparing what is believed to be one of the first pizzas ever captured on camera in Naples, 1890. A year earlier, he had created the famous Pizza Margherita with tomato, mozzarella, and basil in honor of Queen Margherita of Savoy. In 1934, an angry crowd in Shelbyville, Tennessee, gathered outside a jail to seize a black teenager accused of assaulting a 14-year-old girl. Tennessee National Guard troops blocked the mob, using tear gas and then gunfire that left dozens wounded and 4 people dead. NBA star Bill Bradley pauses at New York's Port Authority bus terminal in 1978 to sign autographs for commuters on his way to watch the results of his first election night. Within hours, the Knicks forward would also become a newly elected U.S. Senator, starting an 18-year political career. A young woman in Kutno, Poland smiles while standing behind a rough barbed wire barrier captured on rare Kodachrome color film in 1939. Color street photos from this region and year are extremely uncommon. Italian immigrant woman in New York, 1912, carrying a crate of dry goods balanced on her head through Manhattan streets. Many newly arrived women worked as human freight haulers, moving loads that could weigh as much as they did for only a few cents per trip. 3 soldiers of New Zealand's 28th Maori Battalion pose in Italy in 1944 with barrels of tight mutton birds shipped from home for their Christmas meal. Even on the Italian front, they kept a taste of Maori tradition and New Zealand summer on the table. During the 1918 influenza outbreak, barbers in many cities shaved customers while wearing gauze masks and sterilizing razors between clients. Masked barbershops became one of the clearest everyday reminders of early public health rules about crowds, close contact, and hygiene. Police officers in the U.S. model the captured robes and weapons of the clandestine Black Legion after its members were arrested, 1937. The violent secret society had been broken up after a series of crimes, and its costume was shown publicly as evidence. 4 projectionists pose with massive carbon arc projectors inside Auckland's Majestic Theatre, New Zealand, 1930. They worked in cramped, fireproof rooms because early nitrate film could ignite like gasoline if a reel jammed. 2 inmates at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary pose for a rare double mugshot in Washington's Puget Sound, 1910. The prison often photographed men in pairs to save film and time, so these 2 were strangers whose faces were randomly linked in the archive. World War II, colonial authorities in French North Africa drove gangs of forced laborers to build the Trans-Saharan Railway by hand, 1941. Many of these men were taken from nearby villages to move tons of rock in desert heat for almost no pay. Imperial Japanese troops in Burma move with supply elephants and their handlers, using the animals to haul guns and crates through rivers and jungle where trucks could not go. Both sides in the Burma campaign relied on elephants as living bulldozers. Soldiers of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division slogged through knee-deep mud in their bivouac area near the German border in October 1944, after autumn rains turned forest tracks into rivers of clay. In this campaign, jeeps, trucks, and even tanks were abandoned in the muck so often that engineers joked mud delayed advances more than enemy guns. German Air Force reconnaissance photo of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, taken on 24th June 1941, mapped at a scale of about 1/35,000. The coastline and future city of Tel Aviv are carefully marked as potential targets, plans that vanished after Germany's advance in North Africa collapsed. Spanish nurses line up to greet General Francisco Franco with the raised arm nationalist salute outside a hospital in 1938. Within a year, he would win the Spanish Civil War and rule the country as an authoritarian leader for nearly 4 decades. Andersonville Prison in Georgia, 1864. The Confederacy's biggest camp for captured Union soldiers, where over 30,000 men were packed into a few filthy acres at its peak. Nearly 13,000 prisoners never left this hillside alive. In August 1947, trains at Amritsar were so crowded with families fleeing across the new India-Pakistan border that people clung to roofs, doors, and buffers with all their belongings. Some of these refugee specials ran hundreds of kilometers without room to sit. In a German town in 1945, 2 U.S. military policemen playfully questioned schoolboys who had been given oversized uniforms and rifles in the chaotic final weeks of the conflict. Most teenage and younger auxiliaries captured like these boys were quickly disarmed, briefly questioned. Japanese staff officer of the 28th Army hands his sword to Gurkha Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colbert O.N. Smith during the Japanese surrender near the Sitaung River in Burma, 1945. So ceremonies like this often meant giving up a generations-old weapon along with their command. German soldiers surrendered to troops of the French 1st Armored Division during the liberation of Mulhouse, Alsace, November 22, 23, 1944. This victory opened the road to the Rhine for the French army and symbolized Alsace's return after 4 years of occupation. A U.S. Army machine gun squad of the 2nd Infantry Division holds a firing position north of the Chongchon River in North Korea, 20 November 1950. Within days, Chinese forces would launch a massive counteroffensive here, triggering one of the sharpest retreats of the Korean War. U.S. Marines regroup on the shattered beach of Baeteo after the Battle of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, November 20, 1943. In just 76 hours of fighting on this tiny atoll, over 1,000 Marines and nearly the entire 4,500-strong Japanese garrison lost their lives. Adolf Hitler sits at the front of a banquet hall in Berlin with 107 newly elected Nazi deputies after their breakthrough in the Reichstag elections of September 1930. Within 3 years, this once minority protest party would control the German state and dismantle the very parliament they were celebrating in this photo. In November 1952, a thick oil slick on Cleveland's Cuyahoga River ignited, turning the waterway into a wall of smoke and flame while firefighters sprayed from the banks. Repeated industrial fires on this same river later helped push the United States toward major water pollution reforms, like the 1972 Clean Water Act. In 1962, Arkansas inmate Charles Fields was trusted so much he was issued a pistol while serving a life sentence, then used it to escape, hijack 3 trucks, and launch a 90-minute crime spree before recapture. The rampage left 1 farmer dead and another woman badly assaulted. First Sergeant John Morton of the U.S. 6th Armored Division points to the bullet that punched straight through his helmet during an ambush in France, 17th of November, 1944. After his half-track was knocked out, he fought on, personally taking out nearly 30 enemy soldiers with a carbine. A Palestinian Christian teenager stands before burning barricades in Bethlehem during the First Intifada in 1988, wearing a sweatshirt printed with the face of Jesus. Christian families in the city were a small minority, but many youths still joined or supported the street protests that turned familiar streets into improvised front lines. Before building supercars, Ferruccio Lamborghini made his fortune producing tractors like the ones behind him in this 1960s factory photo. After a dispute with Enzo Ferrari over a faulty clutch, he decided to create his own Grand Tourer, giving birth to the Lamborghini brand. Australian truck driver Bill Morgan was declared clinically dead for 14 minutes after a heart emergency, but somehow pulled through and rebuilt his life. To celebrate, he bought a scratch ticket that won him a car. Then, during a TV reenactment, bought another ticket on camera and hit a $250,000 jackpot. In 1938, Korean conscript Yang Kyung-jong was forced into the Japanese army to fight the USSR, then captured by the Soviets and drafted again to fight Nazi Germany. Seized by the Germans and sent to Normandy, he was captured yet again by U.S. troops on D-Day. During World War II, Canada held thousands of Axis POWs in remote camps, where they played sports, worked paid jobs, and were famously nicknamed the happiest prisoners. Many of these men later chose to immigrate back to Canada with their families, trading barbed wire for a new life. At a U.S. garage sale, a woman named Claire bargained an old card table down to $25, not knowing it was an 18th century John Seymour & Son original with only 6 known examples. She later sold it at auction for about $541,000, turning a casual buy into a small fortune. During World War II, U.S. Navy pilot J. Hunter Reinberg used his aircraft as a flying freezer to make ice cream for his men on a Pacific island. He strapped a can of mix under the wing, climbed to 25,000 feet in freezing air, and landed with freshly frozen chocolate ice cream. American infantrymen of the 30th Old Hickory Division crouch in a muddy lane near Aachen, Germany, waiting for the order to push toward the Siegfried Line on 16 November 1944. Many of these men had already helped stop a major German counterattack at Mortain. On her 18th birthday in 1966, British swimmer Brenda Sherritt swam the entire 22.5-mile, 36.22-kilometer length of Scotland's Loch Ness. She fought through hours of icy water under escort from a small boat, becoming one of the earliest long-distance swimmers to conquer the legendary loch. After the magnitude 7.8 Murchison earthquake hit New Zealand in June 1929, country roads like this one split into jagged fissures for kilometers. The quake triggered thousands of landslides and cut off rural communities for weeks, while crews struggled to reconnect the region. In the frozen woods around Bastogne in late 1944, paratrooper George A. Guckenberger of the 506th PIR, 101st Airborne, warms himself with a cigarette in his snowed-in foxhole. Just weeks later, the 22-year-old would fall in combat and be laid to rest at Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. On 12th of April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin strapped into Vostok 1 and became the first human to orbit Earth in a 108-minute flight. Moments before launch, he radioed his famous "Poyakali," "Let's go," a phrase that instantly became a symbol of the space age. A French schoolgirl kneels at the grave of a British soldier in 1944, part of a tradition where local children adopted Allied graves after the Normandy fighting. In parts of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, families have tended the same individual soldier's grave for generations. Openly gay Dutch artist Willem Arendeus led the 1943 attack on Amsterdam's Public Records Office to destroy files used to track Jewish residents. Captured within a week, he went to his death insisting, "Let it be known that people like us are not cowards." Peanut vendors in Britain sit on a horse cart wearing suits completely covered in real peanuts, turning themselves into walking advertisements. CE early 1900s. Street sellers often used such bizarre costumes to grab attention and boost sales at fairs and markets. Post-war industrial trawlers could haul tens of tons of herring or cod in a single net, flooding decks like this 1950s catch. Such record hauls fed booming cities, but also pushed many traditional fishing grounds toward dangerous overuse. Coal miner Rufus Sargent sits down to dinner, still in his helmet and coal dust, as his young son eats beside him. United States, 1946. Government photographers captured moments like this to show how mining families lived on sparse company wages, with work literally following fathers to the table. Queen Elizabeth II speaks with Winston Churchill, while young Prince Charles and Princess Anne stand nearby during a ceremony in London, 1953. Churchill, who had led Britain through World War II, now served as her first Prime Minister, linking the new Queen to the country's recent past. In 1926, 10-year-old John F. Kennedy sits in his worn football gear at the Dexter School in Brookline, Massachusetts. This frail schoolboy would later command a PT boat in World War II and become the 35th President of the United States. Polish friar Maximilian Kolbe was arrested by German authorities in 1941 for sheltering people, including Jews, in his monastery near Warsaw. A year later in Auschwitz, he volunteered to die in place of another prisoner, an act that led to his canonization as a Catholic saint in 1982. A 4-year-old newsboy stands barefoot on a city street in 1913, already working long hours to help his family survive. Images like this helped push the United States toward child labor laws that finally pulled children out of such jobs. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne sit packed into a C-47, faces blackened and parachutes ready, minutes before the D-Day jump over Normandy in June 1944. Many of these men would drop behind German lines in the dark to seize key roads and bridges before the main landings began. Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II, works in a quarry crew in German-occupied Krakow around 1941, doing hard labor to avoid deportation. Years later, he said these wartime shifts among factory workers shaped his ideas about human dignity and workers' rights. Alfred Hitchcock Arrow directs street scenes for his first, ultimately unfinished film, Number 13, on location in London, 1922. The teenage office boy turned director was still working at a studio art department when he grabbed this chance to move behind the camera. Young Austrian-born soldier Adolf Hitler, Arrow, sits with comrades of Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16 on the Western Front during World War I. Serving as a regimental messenger, he survived some of the war's bloodiest battles and earned the Iron Cross First Class before entering politics. In 1916, this serious schoolboy, Joseph Goebbels, posed with his classmates in Reit, Germany. Within 2 decades, he would control the Third Reich's propaganda machine, turning radio, film, and newspapers into tools of mass persuasion. Las Vegas in 1906 was little more than a remote railroad stop with a depot, a drugstore, a laundry, and a few dusty streets for its roughly 1,000 residents. Within a few decades, these quiet lots would become the famous Las Vegas Strip, one of the most visited urban landscapes on Earth. Father and child show off an enormous cod from the waters off Woongool Ba, Australia, around 1920. For many river families, catches like this were both dinner and the main source of income in the years before refrigeration and sport fishing tourism. Streetcar rails in San Francisco lie twisted like ribbons after the magnitude 7.8 earthquake of April 18, 1906. The quake and the fires that followed destroyed about 80% of the city, bending steel tracks and cobblestones as if they were paper. During the Berlin crisis of 1961, a lone civilian car edges up to the border where a U.S. tank guards the crossing between East and West Berlin. For days, tanks from both superpowers faced each other here only meters apart, turning this quiet street into a tense Cold War front line. Duke Ellington's orchestra plays to a packed Baghdad theater in 1963, while Iraqi TV cameras capture the entire jazz set live. This was part of a U.S. jazz diplomacy tour that sent Ellington across the Middle East and South Asia to showcase American culture abroad. 2 women quietly pay a street seller for a banned white powder while another person keeps watch on a Berlin sidewalk in 1929. The scene captures Weimar Germany's late-night subculture just months before the economic crash. President Harry S. Truman leads calisthenics on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri during a 1947 voyage, proudly wearing a T-shirt labeled Coach Truman Athletic Depth. He turned these daily deck workouts into an informal tradition to boost fitness and morale among the sailors. The famous Deadwood coach carried passengers, mail, and gold through outlaw country on the Cheyenne-Deadwood Trail in 1889. Each trip took about 50 hours with armed guards on board because a single run could be worth tens of thousands of dollars in dust and nuggets. Prospectors stock up at the Red Front Sheep Camp Supply Comer on the Chilkoot Trail during the Klondike Gold Rush, Alaska, c. 1898. Each gold seeker was required to haul nearly a ton of food and gear, turning outfitters like this into the real winners of the rush. Prospectors crowd the Yukon shoreline with homemade rafts and boats, preparing to push upriver toward Dawson City during the Klondike Gold Rush, Canada, 1898. Many of these fragile craft would soon be wrecked or abandoned in the rapids before ever reaching the goldfields. An American Army chaplain shares his pipe and a few quiet words with a captured teenage German soldier near the Western Front in 1918. Tens of thousands of underage boys fought in World War I on all sides, and chaplains were often the first to offer them food, bandages, and news that they would be treated under the rules of war. Confederate cavalrymen from John Hunt Morgan's Raiders sit for a meal as prisoners of war in Western Penitentiary, Pennsylvania, 1863. Unusually for Civil War POWs, they were allowed to keep their broad-brimmed hats and high boots, giving this prison yard scene the look of a frontier saloon. Leon Czolgosz peers through the bars of a steel cell in 1901, shortly after shooting U.S. President William McKinley at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. He was executed later that year, and his body was buried in an unmarked grave so that no one could ever turn the site into a shrine. A 15-year-old boy stares down the camera in his police mugshot after being sentenced to 14 months of hard labor for stealing money in Newcastle, England, in 1873. In Victorian Britain, children could be punished almost like adults, with long terms of brutal labor, even for minor theft. During the California Gold Rush, rancheros staged brutal arena matches, pitting chained grizzly bears against fighting bulls for crowds betting thousands of dollars in gold. Bears almost always overpowered their opponents within minutes, making these spectacles infamous even on the wild frontier. During a brutal 1,600-kilometer ride from Nebraska to Chicago, 9 cowboys raced with almost no rules. Only the first to arrive would win. The winner finished in just 13 days after riding 3 horses until they collapsed from exhaustion, and the event was never held again. In 1917, the French munitions ship SS Mont Blanc exploded in Halifax Harbor after a collision, obliterating the waterfront in a single flash. The blast was so powerful, it created a tsunami, hurled a 3-ton anchor over 3 kilometers, and remained the largest accidental non-nuclear explosion in history. In 1934, 14-year-old Buxton schoolgirl Peggy Mycock is lifted by classmates after being chosen Festival Queen of Buxton, Derbyshire. She was picked from 30 girls to preside over the town's well-dressing week that summer, a bright honor in the middle of the Great Depression.